Hey guys, tonight we begin with why you absolutely, positively wouldn't last a single day in a Mongol conqueror's camp. And I'm not talking about the obvious reasons, like getting trampled by horses or accidentally insulting Genghis Khan's mustache. So before you get comfortable in your climate-controlled room with your artisanal coffee and organic snacks, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially those of you brave enough to stay up late learning about history's most terrifying camping trip. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together through the most hardcore military lifestyle ever devised. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Mongol military camps. Most people picture them as chaotic barbarian settlements where unwashed warriors sat around fires gnawing on horse meat and planning their next rampage. In reality, these were the most disciplined, organized, and efficient military machines the world had ever seen. Think less Mad Max and more Swiss Army with a serious anger management problem. This wasn't some romanticized medieval adventure where knights rode gallantly into battle after a hearty breakfast at the castle. It was a ruthlessly efficient system designed to conquer literally everything between China and Eastern Europe. The Mongols didn't just stumble into building the largest contiguous empire in human history by accident. They did it through military organization so precise it would make a German engineer weep with joy, combined with survival skills that would make Bear Grylls look like a luxury resort guest. The 13th century was basically the medieval equivalent of a battle royale game, except everyone was playing for keeps and there was no respawn button. The Mongolian steppes weren't some pastoral paradise where nomads peacefully herded sheep while composing epic poetry. They were a harsh, unforgiving environment that turned survival into an art form and weakness into a death sentence. Various tribal confederations controlled different grazing territories, and the consequences of that control were simple. You either dominated your neighbors or became their lunch money. If you thought medieval life was all about courtly romance and noble quests, think again. On the steppes, your biggest concern wasn't whether to wear the blue tunic or the red one to court. It was whether you'd live to see another sunrise, and whether that sunrise would reveal enemy warriors charging toward your camp at full gallop. The Mongols lived in a world where climate change wasn't a policy debate. It was a yearly catastrophe that could freeze your livestock, dry up your water sources, or flood your winter shelters. Every decision was life or death. Where to graze your animals, which tribe to ally with, when to migrate. Mess up any of these choices, and your entire family line could be wiped out before the next full moon. The Mongol tribes weren't just competing for resources. They were locked in a constant struggle for survival that made modern corporate politics look like a friendly game of checkers. And into this world of perpetual low-level warfare and environmental extremes stepped the leaders who would eventually unite these fractious tribes into the most successful military force in human history. Enter Temüjin, better known to history as Genghis Khan, who started life with approximately zero advantages and somehow ended up ruling more territory than Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Caesar combined. His childhood reads like a medieval version of Survivor written by someone with a very dark sense of humor. By age 9, his father had been poisoned by rival tribesmen. His family was abandoned by their clan, and young Temüjin was left to figure out how to keep his mother and siblings alive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. But here's the twist that would make Hollywood screenwriters jealous. This kid who grew up eating field mice and hiding in forests eventually figured out how to turn the very harshness that nearly killed him into the foundation of military greatness. While European nobles were learning to read Latin and play chess, Temüjin was mastering the art of survival in conditions that would send modern special forces running for their mothers. One specific example: when enemy tribes captured him and locked him in a wooden collar, did he despair? No. He waited for the perfect moment during a feast, slipped his bonds, and escaped by hiding in a river while his captors searched for him. The man who later became Genghis Khan learned patience, strategy, and ruthless pragmatism not from military academies, but from daily life or death situations. And if you think escaping from a wooden collar while enemies hunt you with torches sounds impressive, wait until you hear about how he convinced his former captors to join his army. This wasn't just about one remarkable individual overcoming adversity. Through pluck and determination, the transformation of Mongol tribal society into a continent-spanning war machine represented a fundamental shift in how military power worked. Before the Mongols, armies were generally seasonal affairs. You gathered your forces when the weather was good, fought a few battles, and then everyone went home to tend their farms or count their gold. The Mongols created something entirely different. A professional military society where every man, woman, and child was part of the war effort, where the entire culture was optimized for conquest, and where traditional concepts like civilian non-combatant became meaningless. They weren't just another nomadic tribe looking for better grazing land. They were a revolutionary military system that could sustain campaigns across vast distances for years at a time. The stakes were nothing less than the reshaping of the medieval world. Every settled civilization from Korea to Hungary would have to adapt or die, and most of them chose poorly. The Mongol way of life wasn't just harsh. It was so perfectly adapted to warfare that it made traditional medieval armies look like costume parties. But Genghis Khan's remarkable rise from outcast to world conqueror was just the beginning. The real genius of Mongol civilization wasn't in producing one exceptional leader. It was in creating a system that could turn ordinary people into components of an unstoppable military machine. And that system started with how they lived. Daily life in a Mongol military camp wasn't just different from what you're used to. It was so alien to modern sensibilities that it might as well have been taking place on Mars. Except Mars would probably have better Wi-Fi and more comfortable sleeping arrangements. Unlike the common assumption that nomadic life was somehow more relaxed and natural than settled civilization, reality was that every single moment of every single day was structured around one goal: staying alive long enough to kill your enemies more efficiently than they could kill you. The historical context for this lifestyle makes modern military boot camps look like luxury spa retreats. Mongol camps weren't temporary stopping points between battles. They were mobile cities designed to function perfectly while moving across thousands of miles of hostile territory. Every aspect of daily routine, from how you arranged your sleeping area to when you were allowed to relieve yourself, was dictated by military necessity and optimized for survival. Why did this develop the way it did? Simple. The Mongols lived in an environment where a single mistake, oversleeping, leaving your weapons in the wrong place, failing to maintain your horse properly, could result in your entire family being wiped out by enemies, wild animals, or the weather. Over generations, they evolved a lifestyle where efficiency wasn't just valued. It was literally a matter of life and death. The camp routine started before dawn and didn't end until well after dark. But this wasn't busy work or arbitrary discipline. Every activity served multiple purposes: physical conditioning, tactical training, equipment maintenance, and social cohesion. When you hear about Mongol warriors being able to ride for days without stopping, living off mare's milk and dried meat, and functioning as a coordinated unit across vast distances, you're not hearing about natural barbarian toughness. You're hearing about the end result of a daily routine so demanding that it would break most modern people before lunch on their first day. Take the morning routine, which makes modern military reveille looked like a leisurely Sunday brunch. Mongol warriors woke up at what we'd consider the middle of the night, not because they enjoyed being miserable, but because dawn was when enemies most often attacked. The first task wasn't grabbing coffee or checking your phone. It was immediately checking your horse, your weapons, and scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. 1. Mongol commander allegedly could identify the approach of enemy forces by the way his horse's ears twitched during morning inspection, which tells you something about both the level of observation skills required and the intimate relationship between warrior and mount that was essential for survival. Another morning ritual involved every warrior consuming a breakfast that would make modern nutritionists have nervous breakdowns. Fermented maize milk mixed with dried meat and animal fat, designed to provide maximum calories and nutrients while being completely portable and non-perishable. But here's where it gets really alien to modern sensibilities. Personal hygiene in Mongol camps wasn't about looking good or smelling pleasant. It was about tactical advantage. Warriors didn't bathe regularly, not because they were dirty barbarians, but because human scent could alert enemy scouts or wild animals from miles away. Instead, they had elaborate routines for maintaining their equipment that were more thorough than most people's personal care routines today. The daily weapon maintenance ritual would impress modern special forces. Every warrior spent at least an hour each morning checking bowstrings, arrow fletching, sword edges, and armor joints. A loose arrow fletching could mean the difference between killing an enemy and having that enemy kill you and your entire family. They maintained their bows with the same attention to detail that modern Formula One teams use for race cars, because the consequences of equipment failure were equally catastrophic. Midday activities centered around horse care, which wasn't just feeding and watering animals. It was maintaining the technological foundation of the entire military system. Each warrior was responsible for multiple horses, and the daily routine included checking hooves for stones or injuries, examining saddles and tack for wear, and training exercises that maintained the almost supernatural coordination between rider and mount that made Mongol cavalry so devastating. One specific example shows how this worked in practice. During long campaigns, Mongol warriors would rotate between horses throughout the day to prevent any single animal from becoming exhausted. The midday horse rotation wasn't just switching mounts. It was a complex procedure where warriors had to transfer weapons, supplies, and equipment between animals while maintaining readiness for combat. Imagine changing cars while driving on the highway, except the cars are living animals with their own opinions, and enemy forces might attack at any moment. Evening routines involved what modern people would consider multiple full-time jobs compressed into a few hours. After the day's march or combat, warriors had to set up defensive positions, tend to wounded comrades and animals, repair equipment damaged during the day, and prepare for potential night attacks. The evening meal wasn't the social gathering around a campfire. It was a tactical briefing combined with equipment maintenance while consuming whatever food was available, which might be anything from captured enemy supplies to blood drawn from their own horses. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing involving the Mongols ever was. The complicating factor that would drive modern efficiency experts insane was that this incredibly regimented lifestyle somehow had to remain flexible enough to adapt to constantly changing conditions. A routine that worked perfectly on the grasslands of Mongolia might be completely useless in the forests of Eastern Europe or the deserts of Central Asia. The contradictory evidence shows that while Mongol camps were more disciplined than European armies, they were also more adaptable. European military organization was based on rigid hierarchy and standardized procedures. Everyone did the same thing the same way regardless of circumstances. Mongol organization was based on what modern military theorists would call mission-type orders. Every warrior understood the overall objective, and was trained to improvise methods based on local conditions. Different perspectives on Mongol daily life come from the fact that their lifestyle looked like chaos to outside observers, but functioned like clockwork from the inside. Chinese chroniclers described Mongol camps as disorganized barbarian settlements, while captured European knights reported that Mongol military organization was more sophisticated than anything they'd encountered in their own armies. Why this situation was more complex than it appears comes down to the fundamental contradiction at the heart of nomadic military culture. You had to be completely predictable to your allies and completely unpredictable to your enemies, often simultaneously. The daily routine that kept a Mongol army functioning had to be standardized enough that warriors from different tribes could coordinate perfectly, but flexible enough that the entire system could adapt to new environments, new enemies, and new tactical situations without breaking down. A modern analogy would be trying to run a Fortune 500 company where the entire organization might have to relocate to a different continent with 24 hours notice, continue operating at full efficiency during the move, and be ready to completely restructure their business model based on whatever they found when they arrived. Except instead of losing market share if you failed, you and everyone you cared about would be killed. The result was a military culture that produced warriors who were simultaneously more disciplined than European knights and more adaptable than European mercenaries. Mongol soldiers could function effectively in climates ranging from Siberian tundra to Middle Eastern deserts, against enemies using completely different weapons and tactics, while maintaining unit cohesion across distances. That would fragment traditional armies. Who was affected by this system? Everyone, but not in ways you'd expect. Mongol women weren't just camp followers. They were integral parts of the military organization, managing logistics, maintaining equipment, and often fighting alongside the men. Children weren't just along for the ride. They were apprentices, warriors learning skills that would determine their survival as adults. Even elderly Mongols had specific roles in maintaining the camp's efficiency and passing down tactical knowledge. How people responded to this lifestyle varied dramatically. Some prisoners of war who were incorporated into Mongol armies initially found the routine impossibly demanding, but those who survived often became among the most loyal and effective warriors. The physical and mental conditioning that the lifestyle required was so intense that it created a bond between warriors that went beyond mere military discipline. Institutional reactions from settled civilizations were consistently shocked disbelief. European and Chinese military observers couldn't understand how an army could maintain such discipline while remaining so mobile, or how warriors could be so individually skilled while functioning as part of such a large, coordinated force. The daily routine that made this possible was so different from their own military traditions that they often dismissed it as primitive barbarian practices, right up until those primitive barbarians conquered their territories. Long-term implications of this lifestyle extended far beyond military success. The Mongol daily routine created a culture where adaptation and efficiency weren't just military virtues. They were survival requirements that shaped every aspect of society. This produced a civilization that could absorb useful innovations from conquered territories while maintaining its core military effectiveness, allowing the Mongol Empire to grow and adapt rather than simply expand and collapse. The system also created a feedback loop where military success reinforced the lifestyle that made military success possible. Each conquest validated the harsh daily routine and demanding physical conditioning, making it easier to maintain discipline and harder for warriors to question whether there might be easier ways to live. Meanwhile, while Mongol warriors were perfecting this demanding daily routine, they were also developing innovations in military technology and tactics that would revolutionize warfare across 3 continents. The same culture that demanded perfection in personal discipline and equipment maintenance was constantly experimenting with new weapons, new strategies, and new ways to coordinate large-scale military operations. The connection between the previous content and what's coming next is crucial. The daily routine we've just explored wasn't just about individual survival or even unit cohesion. It was the foundation that made possible the tactical innovations and strategic thinking that allowed relatively small Mongol forces to defeat much larger armies equipped with superior weapons and defending prepared positions. The discipline required to maintain equipment perfectly while living in constant motion, the adaptability needed to function in any environment, and the coordination necessary to manage complex logistics across vast distances. All of these capabilities that were built into everyday camp life became the building blocks for military innovations that changed the world. But the real genius of Mongol military culture wasn't just in creating tough individual warriors or even well-coordinated units. It was in developing a system of tactical flexibility and strategic innovation that could turn any situation to their advantage, no matter how hopeless it initially appeared. If the demanding daily routine of Mongol camps was like attending the world's most hardcore boot camp every single day for your entire life, then their military tactics were like having access to cheat codes that nobody else knew existed. While European knights were still figuring out how to charge in straight lines without falling off their horses, and Chinese generals were writing poetry about the honor of defeat, the Mongols were developing military innovations that wouldn't be matched until the invention of modern combined arms warfare. The context for these tactical innovations makes them even more impressive when you realize they were developed by people who didn't have military academies, staff colleges, or centuries of written military theory. What they had was something far more valuable, a culture where tactical thinking was literally a survival skill that every child learned alongside writing and archery. While European nobles were learning Latin conjugations and courtly etiquette, Mongol children were playing games that taught them to think strategically about terrain, weather, enemy psychology, and resource management. Why this became important goes beyond mere military effectiveness. The Mongols developed a way of warfare that was so fundamentally different from everyone else's approach that their enemies often didn't even recognize what was happening to them until it was too late. Traditional medieval warfare was about honor, individual heroics, and proving your courage through direct confrontation. Mongol warfare was about winning as efficiently as possible, while losing as few of your own people as possible, which sounds obvious until you realize that most medieval armies considered this approach somehow cheating. The Mongols became relevant, not just because they were tough individual fighters. Lots of cultures produced tough fighters. They became world conquerors because they figured out how to make warfare itself more effective. They approached military problems the same way modern engineers approach technical challenges: identify the objective, analyze the constraints, and find the most efficient solution regardless of whether it fits traditional expectations. This engineering approach to violence made them nearly unstoppable against enemies who were still thinking about war as a form of elaborate performance art. Consider the siege of Kaifeng in 1232, which demonstrates Mongol tactical innovation in ways that would make modern military planners take notes. The city was one of the most heavily fortified in China, defended by sophisticated siege engines, multiple walls, and a garrison that outnumbered the attacking Mongols by approximately 10-1. Traditional siege warfare would have involved surrounding the city, building your own siege engines, and then spending months or years trying to break down the walls while losing thousands of soldiers in the process. The Mongols looked at this situation and basically said, "That sounds expensive and time-consuming. Let's try something else." Instead of a traditional siege, They implemented what military historians now recognize as one of the first examples of modern psychological warfare combined with economic disruption. They didn't just surround Kaifeng, they systematically destroyed every source of food, water, and trade in a radius of hundreds of miles around the city. But here's where it gets diabolical. They didn't just cut off supplies. They used captured Chinese engineers to build siege weapons that were more advanced than anything the defenders had, then employed Chinese defectors who knew the city's weaknesses to plan their attacks. The Mongols turned the defenders' own technology and knowledge against them while simultaneously making it impossible for the city to sustain itself. Key players in this siege included Chinese generals who had switched sides, not because they were cowards, but because the Mongols offered them something the Chinese imperial system didn't: merit-based promotion and the opportunity to implement tactical innovations that Chinese tradition considered inappropriate. One Chinese engineer allegedly designed siege engines for the Mongols that were more effective than anything he'd been allowed to build for his original employers. The drama and conflict reached its peak when the city's population, facing starvation, began fighting among themselves over the remaining food supplies. The Mongols didn't have to break down the walls. They just waited for the city to consume itself from within. The resolution was brutal but efficient. Kaifeng surrendered after the Mongols demonstrated that they could maintain the siege indefinitely, while the defenders could not. This story encapsulates broader Mongol tactical principles that would be recognizable to modern special forces. Use superior intelligence gathering, turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses, minimize your own casualties, while maximizing enemy losses, and always have multiple backup plans. The human elements that bring this story to life include accounts of Mongol commanders who could calculate supply requirements for armies of hundreds of thousands of soldiers while planning campaigns that would last for years across multiple continents. Another case study involves the Battle of Mohi in 1241, where the Mongols faced a Hungarian army that had learned from previous defeats and implemented defensive strategies, specifically designed to counter Mongol tactics. The Hungarians chose excellent defensive terrain, built fortifications that should have neutralized Mongol mobility advantages, and outnumbered the attackers by nearly 2-to-1. The Mongol response was so tactically sophisticated that European military observers didn't understand what had happened until centuries later. Instead of attacking the Hungarian position directly, which was what the defenders expected and prepared for, the Mongols implemented a coordinated multi-day operation involving diversionary attacks, night movements, and psychological warfare that gradually drew the Hungarian army out of their defensive positions. The breakthrough moment came when the Mongols appeared to retreat in disorder, which looked like a victory to the Hungarians until they realized they'd been manipulated into pursuing the fleeing Mongols directly into a carefully prepared killing ground. The broader significance of this battle was that it demonstrated Mongol ability to adapt their tactics in real time to counter enemy innovations, something that required a level of command flexibility and communication efficiency that European armies wouldn't match for centuries. This tactical sophistication wasn't isolated to a few exceptional commanders or lucky circumstances. The pattern that emerges from studying multiple Mongol campaigns is a systematic approach to warfare that treated every battle as a problem-solving exercise rather than a test of courage or honor. Other examples of this pattern include their campaigns in Eastern Europe, where they consistently defeated larger, better-equipped European armies by refusing to fight the kind of battles their enemies wanted to fight. At Legnica, Liegnitz, and dozens of other engagements, the Mongols used the same basic approach: gather superior intelligence, identify enemy weaknesses, manipulate the tactical situation to maximize their advantages, and then execute coordinated attacks that gave their opponents no opportunity to recover. The pattern explanation reveals why this approach was so effective. while European armies were optimized for single decisive battles where individual heroics could determine the outcome. Mongol armies were optimized for campaigns where strategic thinking and logistical efficiency determined success. European knights trained to be individually superior warriors. Mongol warriors trained to be components in a military system that was collectively superior to anything their enemies could field. Why this pattern existed goes back to the environmental and social factors that shaped Mongol culture. On the steppes, survival required constant adaptation to changing conditions, cooperation with people from different tribal backgrounds, and efficient use of limited resources. These same skills, when applied to warfare, produced tactical innovations that settled civilizations with their emphasis on tradition and established procedures. Couldn't match. Social, political, and economic factors reinforced this pattern because Mongol military organization rewarded innovation and punished failure, regardless of social background. A shepherd who developed an effective new tactic could be promoted to command positions over aristocrats who failed to produce results. This meritocratic approach encouraged tactical experimentation in ways that traditional feudal military systems actively discouraged. Comparison to other time period shows that the Mongols were doing in the 13th century what wouldn't become standard military practice until the development of modern staff systems in the 19th and 20th centuries. They were conducting detailed intelligence gathering, coordinating complex multi-unit operations across vast distances, and adapting their tactics based on systematic analysis of enemy capabilities and weaknesses. The effects of these tactical innovations extended far beyond Mongol military success. They fundamentally changed how warfare was conducted across 3 continents and influenced military thinking for centuries afterward. Who benefited from these innovations wasn't always obvious. Obviously, the Mongols themselves became the rulers of the largest contiguous empire in human history. But the real winners were often the technical specialists, engineers, and administrators from conquered territories who found opportunities in the Mongol system that their original societies had denied them. Chinese siege engineers, Persian administrators, and European craftsmen could advance based on merit rather than birth, creating a brain drain from traditional societies to Mongol service. Who suffered were the traditional military elites, who couldn't adapt to new tactical realities. European knights, Chinese imperial armies, and Islamic military orders that had dominated warfare for centuries suddenly found themselves obsolete, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because their entire approach to military organization was fundamentally less efficient than Mongol innovations. Unintended consequences included the spread of military technology and techniques across the known world. The Mongols didn't just conquer territories. They absorbed useful innovations from each conquest and spread them throughout their empire. Chinese siege engines appeared in European battles. Persian administrative techniques were implemented in China, and European metallurgy improved weapons production in Central Asia. How this shaped future developments is visible in the military revolutions that followed Mongol conquests. European armies eventually adopted many Mongol tactical principles, leading to the development of combined arms tactics, professional military organization, and strategic thinking that emphasized flexibility over tradition. The Ottoman military system, which dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, was heavily influenced by Mongol organizational principles. Modern parallels include the way contemporary military forces emphasize adaptability, intelligence, gathering, and technological integration over traditional concepts of military honor and individual heroics. Special forces operations, with their emphasis on small unit tactics, superior intelligence, and mission flexibility, are recognizably descended from Mongol military thinking. The lessons for contemporary issues extend beyond military affairs. The Mongol approach to innovation, identifying what works, discarding what doesn't, and adapting solutions from wherever you can find them is essentially the same methodology that drives successful modern organizations, whether they're technology, companies, medical research teams, or disaster relief operations. Yet even as the Mongols were perfecting these revolutionary military tactics and conquering vast territories with unprecedented efficiency, they were also creating a different kind of revolution that was perhaps even more significant. They were transforming the very nature of political and social organization across their empire. The transition to our next major element involves understanding that military success was only the beginning of the Mongol transformation of medieval society. The same tactical flexibility and merit-based organization that made them unstoppable in battle also made them remarkably effective at governing the Temüjin. Diverse populations they conquered. But this transition from conquerors to administrators created new challenges and contradictions that would ultimately determine the long-term fate of their empire. The peak drama and conflict that's coming next involves not just military campaigns, but the fundamental question of whether a society organized around warfare and conquest could successfully transform itself into a stable governing system. The answer to this question would determine the fate of millions of people across 3 continents and shape the development of global civilization for centuries to come. By 1227, the Mongol Empire had reached a breaking point that would make modern corporate succession battles look like polite disagreements over office coffee preferences. The situation that had created the largest contiguous empire in human history was about to face its ultimate test. What happens when the guy who built the whole thing dies, and everyone who helped him conquer the world suddenly realizes they might have different ideas about who should be in charge next? The description of tensions and problems reads like a medieval version of Game of Thrones, written by someone who actually understood military logistics. Genghis Khan had spent decades creating a military machine so effective that it had conquered territories from Korea to Eastern Europe. But he'd been so busy conquering that he'd apparently forgotten to create a foolproof succession plan. This oversight was about to turn the most successful military organization in history into a family drama with the potential for worldwide consequences. Key players involved included Genghis Khan's 4 sons by his primary wife, each of whom had legitimate claims to leadership and had proven themselves as military commanders. But here's where it gets complicated. Mongol tradition emphasized merit and ability over simple primogeniture, which sounds democratic and progressive until you realize it meant that succession could be determined by anything from political maneuvering to actual warfare between brothers who commanded armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The stakes involved weren't just about who got to wear the fancy hat and sit on the throne. The Mongol Empire in 1227 was essentially a military confederation held together by personal loyalty to Genghis Khan, shared commitment to continued conquest, and a system of rewards that depended on constant expansion. Without clear leadership, this confederation could fragment into multiple warring factions, each controlling enough territory and military force to reshape the political landscape of entire continents. What made this crisis particularly dangerous was that it was happening at the moment of the empire's greatest success. The Mongols had just completed the conquest of the Western Xia and Jin dynasties. Their armies were positioned for potential campaigns into Europe and the Middle East, and their military system was at peak efficiency. But all of this success was built on a foundation of personal authority that was about to disappear, leaving questions about whether the empire was an institution that could survive its founder or simply a collection of tribes, temporarily united by one exceptional leader. The succession crisis began with what should have been a routine military campaign, but turned into a comedy of errors that would have been hilarious if it hadn't involved the fate of half the known world. In 1227, Genghis Khan was leading what was supposed to be a final campaign against the Western Shah, partly to complete the conquest of China, and partly because, at age 65, he was apparently still convinced that the best way to spend his golden years was personally leading cavalry charges against fortified cities. The build-up to the crisis involved Genghis Khan's increasing awareness that he wasn't going to live forever, combined with his characteristic inability to do anything the simple way. Instead of just naming his oldest son as heir and calling it a day, he decided to test his potential successors through a series of military commands and political responsibilities that turned into an elaborate competition between brothers who were already suspicious of each other's ambitions. Key moments in this developing drama included a series of increasingly tense family meetings where Genghis Khan would announce his latest thoughts about succession, usually contradicting whatever he'd said the previous week. According to various chronicles, these meetings featured the kind of family dynamics that would make modern therapists rich, with each son trying to prove his worthiness while undermining his brother's claims through a combination of military achievements and political maneuvering. The dialogue, as recorded by later historians, suggests conversations that were equal parts strategic planning session and family intervention. Genghis Khan would lecture his sons about the importance of unity, while simultaneously encouraging them to compete for his approval. His sons would pledge loyalty to each other while clearly plotting how to eliminate each other as potential rivals. The whole situation had the kind of toxic family dynamics that would be perfect for reality television, except the stakes were global conquest rather than just embarrassing yourself on camera. Play-by-play of important scenes includes the moment when Genghis Khan allegedly gathered his sons around his deathbed to announce his final decision about succession, only to discover that his health was failing faster than his ability to resolve the political crisis he'd created. Instead of providing clear guidance, his final instructions were characteristically contradictory. He wanted his sons to work together, but he also wanted them to prove themselves through individual achievement. He wanted to maintain Mongol traditions, but he also wanted to adapt to the realities of governing a sedentary empire. Character motivations during this crisis revealed a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Mongol success. Joki, the eldest son, had legitimate claims to succession, but was suspected by his brothers of having questionable paternity, a family scandal that could destabilize the entire empire. Gedai, the third son, was considered the most capable administrator, but lacked the military reputation that Mongol leadership traditionally required. Tolui, the youngest, was the most skilled military commander but was considered too traditional in his approach to governance. Unexpected developments included the discovery that Genghis Khan's death wasn't the end of the succession crisis. It was just the beginning. The Mongol tradition of Kurultai, or assembly of tribal leaders, meant that succession had to be confirmed by a gathering of military commanders and tribal representatives from across the empire. This process, which was supposed to ensure legitimacy and unity, instead created opportunities for months of political maneuvering while the empire's military campaigns were effectively on hold. The climax of the succession crisis came when the Kurultai finally convened in 1229, 2 years after Genghis Khan's death, to formally choose his successor. By this point, the political situation had evolved into a complex web of alliances, compromises, and barely contained threats of civil war. Each potential successor had spent 2 years building support among different factions of the Mongol elite, creating a situation where the wrong decision could literally tear the empire apart. The immediate aftermath of the Kurultai's decision to name Gedai as Great Khan appeared to resolve the crisis, but actually created new problems that would plague the empire for generations. The other brothers accepted the decision publicly while privately maintaining their own power bases and ambitions. This created a system where the Great Khan had ultimate authority in theory, but practical power was distributed among family members, who had their own armies, territories, and agendas. The response to the succession crisis was as varied as the empire itself, revealing just how many different groups had stakes in Mongol political stability. Military commanders who had built their careers on constant conquest found themselves wondering whether the new leadership would maintain the aggressive expansion that had made them wealthy and powerful. Chinese administrators, who had been incorporated into the Mongol system, worried whether succession disputes might lead to civil wars that would devastate the territories they were supposed to govern. Various parties' reactions followed predictable lines of self-interest, disguised as principled positions. Mongol traditionalists argued that succession should follow ancient steppe customs that emphasized the worthiest candidate rather than simple inheritance. Administrators from conquered territories favored stable succession rules that would provide predictable governance. Military leaders wanted confirmation that conquest would continue, while settled populations hoped that succession might lead to more peaceful policies. Immediate consequences included a temporary halt to major military campaigns while the succession was resolved, which gave enemy territories crucial time to prepare defenses and organize resistance. European kingdoms that had been expecting Mongol invasions instead found themselves with a reprieve that they used to study Mongol tactics and develop countermeasures. Chinese resistance movements had time to regroup and plan rebellions against Mongol occupation. Political fallout from the succession crisis established precedents that would shape Mongol governance for the remainder of the empire's existence. The compromise that made Did Great Khan, while allowing his brothers to maintain semi-independent power bases, created a federal system that was more flexible than centralized autocracy, but also more prone to internal conflicts. This system worked well when the empire was expanding and there were enough spoils to satisfy everyone's ambitions, but would prove problematic when expansion slowed. How this changed everything was subtle but fundamental. The succession crisis demonstrated that the Mongol Empire was becoming too large and complex to be governed as a simple extension of steppe tribal leadership. The political compromises necessary to maintain unity required increasingly sophisticated administrative systems and diplomatic skills that were different from the military virtues that had created the empire in the first place. What it ironically revealed about the system was that Mongol political organization was simultaneously more flexible and more fragile than it appeared. The empire could survive the death of its founder and continue expanding, which showed institutional strength that most medieval states lacked. But the process of succession required such careful political management that future transitions would become increasingly difficult as the empire grew larger and more diverse. Long-term effects included the establishment of succession practices that tried to balance Mongol traditions with the practical requirements of governing a vast empire. Future successions would involve similar political negotiations and compromises, creating a pattern where each transition was a potential crisis that had to be carefully managed to prevent civil war. Why historians still debate this crisis is that it represents a crucial turning point where the Mongol Empire either could have fragmented into multiple competing states or evolved into a more stable imperial system. The decisions made during the succession crisis determined not just who would rule, but what kind of state the Mongol Empire would become and how long it could maintain unity across such vast and diverse territories. This succession crisis wasn't just a family dispute with global consequences. It was a fundamental test of whether a political system designed for tribal confederation could successfully scale up to govern a transcontinental empire. The deeper meaning of the crisis lay in the contradiction between Mongol military culture, which emphasized personal leadership and warrior virtues, and the administrative requirements of governing settled populations with completely different traditions and expectations. What the crisis revealed about the system was that Mongol success had created problems that Mongol traditions weren't designed to solve. The empire had grown beyond the point where personal relationships and tribal customs could provide adequate governance. But the Mongols were reluctant to abandon the cultural practices that had made them successful. This tension between tradition and necessity would continue to shape imperial politics for generations. The broader implications extended beyond the Mongol Empire to influence medieval political development across Eurasia. The succession crisis demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of nomadic political organization, showing that steppe peoples could create stable institutions, but only through careful adaptation of traditional practices to new circumstances. Long-term effects on global political development included the establishment of precedents for managing succession in multi-ethnic empires that would influence later imperial systems. The Mongol approach to balancing central authority with regional autonomy, federal structure with unified military command, and traditional legitimacy with administrative efficiency created a template that other empires would study and adapt. Why this matters for understanding medieval political development is that the Mongol succession crisis was one of the first times in history that a truly global empire had to solve the problem of institutional continuity. The solutions they developed, including formal succession procedures, administrative federalism, and the integration of diverse cultural traditions into imperial governance, would become standard features of later imperial systems. The crisis also established the principle that imperial legitimacy required both traditional validation and practical effectiveness. Future Mongol leaders would need to maintain their credentials as steppe warriors while also demonstrating their ability to govern complex administrative systems, a dual requirement that would shape imperial culture for centuries and influence the development of political institutions far beyond the Mongol Empire itself. Around the main events of Mongol conquest and political drama, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles that would make modern screenwriters weep with envy at the sheer variety of compelling personalities involved. These weren't just extras in the background of history. They were individuals whose personal stories illuminate the human complexity behind the world's most successful military machine. Subutai was essentially the Mongol Empire's version of a strategic genius who happened to also be completely insane by any reasonable standard. This man commanded military campaigns across distances that modern armies would find challenging even with GPS, satellite communication, and logistical support systems that the Mongols couldn't even imagine. He allegedly planned and executed coordinated attacks involving multiple armies separated by thousands of miles, using nothing more sophisticated than mounted messengers and an understanding of seasonal weather patterns that bordered on supernatural. His story reads like military science fiction disguised as historical fact. Subutai could calculate how long it would take for armies to march across Central Asian deserts, factor in seasonal variations in water availability, predict when rivers would be frozen enough to support cavalry crossings, and coordinate all of these variables into campaign plans that unfolded over multiple years across multiple continents. One specific example: he simultaneously commanded operations in Eastern Europe while planning campaigns in China, somehow managing to be personally present at crucial battles on both fronts, despite the distances involved being literally impossible to cover in the time available. The significance of Subutai's contribution to Mongol success goes beyond mere tactical brilliance. He represented the principle that merit could triumph over birth in ways that would have been impossible in contemporary European or Chinese military systems. Subutai wasn't a member of Genghis Khan's family, or even from a particularly prominent tribe. He was promoted purely based on his ability to win battles while losing fewer soldiers than his competitors. His career trajectory from minor tribal warrior to supreme military commander demonstrated that the Mongol system could identify and reward talent regardless of social background. Yellow Shukai represented a completely different aspect of Mongol adaptability, the capacity to integrate intellectual talent from conquered civilizations into imperial administration. This Chinese scholar and administrator became one of the most influential figures in Mongol governance despite having every reason to hate his conquerors. His family had served the Jin dynasty that the Mongols destroyed. His cultural background emphasized Confucian values that seemed incompatible with nomadic warrior culture, and his entire worldview was based on principles of stable governance. That appeared to contradict Mongol preferences for conquest and mobility. Yet Yelu Chukai showed different aspects of the Mongol approach to governance by demonstrating how the empire could absorb useful innovations from any source. He convinced Mongol leaders to adopt Chinese administrative practices not by arguing for cultural superiority, but by proving that efficient tax collection and record-keeping could fund more military campaigns. His approach to integrating Chinese bureaucratic traditions with Mongol military organization created hybrid systems that were more effective than either culture could have developed independently. His contribution to the ongoing narrative was crucial because he represented the transformation of the Mongol Empire from a purely military confederation into a governing system capable of administering diverse populations. The administrative innovations he introduced allowed the Mongols to extract resources from conquered territories more efficiently than previous conquerors, while also providing services that made imperial rule more acceptable to settled populations. Bert, Genghis Khan's primary wife, showed another angle of Mongol society that challenges modern assumptions about medieval gender roles. She wasn't just the Khan's spouse. She was a political advisor, military strategist, and economic manager whose influence shaped imperial policy in ways that were often invisible to outside observers, but crucial to internal functioning. Her story illustrates how Mongol women could exercise political power in ways that were impossible for women in contemporary European or Chinese societies. The human elements of her story include accounts of her being kidnapped by rival tribes early in her marriage, an event that triggered some of Genghis Khan's first major military campaigns. But rather than being portrayed as a passive victim, historical sources suggest she maintained communication with her husband during captivity and provided intelligence about enemy positions and intentions that contributed to her own rescue. Her role in Mongol politics continued throughout the empire's expansion, with evidence suggesting she influenced decisions about succession, military strategy, and diplomatic relations with conquered peoples. These weren't isolated incidents involving separate individuals who happened to live during the same historical period. The web of relationships, political networks, and personal connections that linked these supporting characters created a complex social system that was far more sophisticated than the stereotypical image of barbarian chieftains leading undisciplined hordes. How stories connect reveals the dense network of personal relationships that held the Mongol Empire together. Subutai's military campaigns were supported by administrative systems that Yelu Chukai developed, which were in turn influenced by political decisions that Bert helped shape. The success of military operations depended on efficient logistics, which required effective administration, which needed political stability, which relied on careful management of family relationships and tribal alliances. Webs of relationships extended beyond the imperial family to include marriage alliances, adoption arrangements, and mentor-student relationships that created bonds of loyalty and obligation across tribal, ethnic, and geographic boundaries. Mongol leaders routinely adopted talented individuals from conquered peoples, creating artificial kinship networks that supplemented natural family connections. These adoption practices meant that a Chinese administrator like Yelu Chukai could become as politically influential as Mongol tribal leaders, while maintaining his cultural identity and continuing to serve as a bridge between Chinese and Mongol traditions. Political and social networks operated on principles that were simultaneously more meritocratic and more personal than contemporary European or Chinese systems. Advancement depended on demonstrated ability rather than inherited status, but success also required navigation of complex personal relationships and family politics. This combination created opportunities for remarkable social mobility while also demanding sophisticated social skills that went far beyond simple military competence. How one event led to another demonstrates the interconnected nature of Mongol political culture. Subutai's early military successes brought him to Genghis Khan's attention, which led to his promotion to independent command, which enabled him to develop the strategic innovations that made possible the conquest of territories that provided the administrative challenges that required talents like those of Yelu Chukai, whose solutions created the governmental capacity that allowed figures like Bert to exercise political influence beyond traditional tribal boundaries. Unintended consequences and connections created feedback loops that strengthened the imperial system while also creating new vulnerabilities. The integration of foreign administrators provided valuable expertise, but also introduced competing cultural values and political traditions that sometimes conflicted with Mongol customs. Marriage alliances that were intended to secure tribal loyalty also created potential succession disputes when children from these marriages claimed imperial inheritance. Adoption practices that were designed to expand the pool of talented leaders also complicated questions about legitimate authority and traditional precedence. The most fascinating aspect of these interconnected stories is how they revealed the Mongol Empire as a dynamic system that was constantly evolving in response to new challenges and opportunities. Each successful adaptation created new possibilities that required further adaptations, producing a cycle of innovation and adjustment that allowed the empire to continue growing and adapting long after the initial conquests were complete. These networks also explain how the Mongol Empire could maintain coherence across vast distances and diverse populations. Personal relationships and family connections provided communication channels and trust networks that supplemented official administrative systems. When formal governmental structures were inadequate for managing complex situations, personal relationships could provide alternative mechanisms for coordination and problem-solving. The interconnected nature of these stories also illuminates how the Mongol Empire managed to balance competing interests and cultural traditions, rather than simply imposing a single system on all conquered territories. The Mongols created flexible networks that could accommodate different approaches to governance, military organization, and social relationships while maintaining overall imperial unity and effectiveness. To understand these supporting characters and their interconnected stories, you have to understand the cultural elements that shaped daily life in the Mongol Empire. This wasn't just a matter of different languages or religious practices. It was a fundamental difference in how people thought about identity, loyalty, and social organization that affected every aspect of imperial politics and administration. Daily life in the Mongol Empire involved constant interaction between people from radically different cultural backgrounds who had to find ways to cooperate, despite having completely different assumptions about everything from proper diet to appropriate religious practices. Mongol camps might include warriors from the steppes, Chinese administrators, Persian craftsmen, European prisoners of war, and local guides, all of whom had to work together while maintaining their distinct cultural identities, beliefs, and attitudes. That shaped this multicultural environment emphasized pragmatic adaptation over ideological purity. Mongols were generally tolerant of different religious practices, as long as they didn't interfere with military effectiveness or political loyalty. This tolerance wasn't based on modern concepts of religious freedom, but on the practical recognition that forcing cultural conformity would be both difficult to enforce and counterproductive to imperial efficiency. Social structures in racial affairs and from within Mongol society were simultaneously more flexible and more hierarchical than those of settled civilizations. Status was primarily determined by military achievement and political favor rather than birth or wealth, which created opportunities for rapid social advancement. But the military nature of Mongol society also meant that hierarchy was strictly maintained and challenges to authority were severely punished. What was normal versus exceptional in Mongol culture would have seemed backwards to contemporary European or Chinese observers. It was normal for women to exercise significant political influence, for foreigners to hold high administrative positions, and for military commanders to be promoted based on merit rather than social background. It was exceptional for anyone to question military orders, for individual desires to take precedence over collective needs, or for cultural traditions to interfere with military efficiency. But how this cultural context shaped events becomes clear when you consider that the supporting characters we've discussed could only have emerged in a society that valued practical results over traditional expectations. Subutai's military innovations, Yelu Chukai's administrative reforms, and Bert's political influence were all possible because Mongol culture prioritized effectiveness over convention in ways that other medieval societies could not match. Perhaps most fascinating about these supporting characters was how their stories revealed fundamental contradictions in Mongol society that somehow strengthened rather than weakened the imperial system. The empire that conquered the world through military discipline also promoted individual initiative in ways that would have been impossible in more traditional societies. Examples of contradictions include the fact that the Mongols, who were stereotyped as destructive barbarians, created one of history's most sophisticated systems for preserving and transmitting knowledge across cultural boundaries. Yelu Chukai's administrative innovations weren't just adopted by the Mongols. They were systematically spread throughout the empire and adapted to local conditions in ways that preserved useful elements while discarding impractical aspects. How things weren't what they seemed extends to the relationship between conquest and cultural development. Rather than simply destroying the civilizations they conquered, the Mongols created mechanisms for cultural exchange that were more effective than anything achieved by peaceful trade or diplomatic contact. The empire became a transmission system for ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions that connected civilizations that had previously been isolated from each other. Modern parallels to these contradictions appear in contemporary situations, where disruptive organizations end up preserving and strengthening the very systems they initially challenge. The Mongol approach to cultural integration, absorbing useful innovations while maintaining core organizational principles, resembles how successful modern companies adapt to new markets and technologies while preserving their competitive advantages. The supporting characters embody these contradictions because they succeeded by embracing rather than resolving the tensions in Mongol society. Subutai combined traditional steppe warrior culture with innovative strategic thinking. Yelu Chukai maintained his Chinese identity while becoming one of the empire's most influential Mongol administrators. Bert exercised political power through traditional family relationships while breaking traditional gender expectations. These contradictions weren't problems to be solved. They were sources of strength that allowed the empire to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. Everything changed when the Mongols realized that conquering the world was actually the easy part. It was figuring out what to do with it afterward that would drive them to the brink of madness. This realization didn't come all at once like some dramatic movie revelation. but gradually dawned on them as they found themselves in possession of territories so vast and diverse that traditional nomadic governance was about as useful as a chocolate teapot for managing the administrative nightmare they'd accidentally created. The background to this change was rooted in the fundamental incompatibility between a lifestyle designed for mobility and conquest and the requirements of governing settled populations who expected things like consistent tax policies, reliable legal systems, and infrastructure maintenance. The Mongols had perfected the art of showing up, destroying enemy armies, and moving on to the next target. But now they own Chinese cities with millions of inhabitants, Persian trade networks that span continents, and European territories, with complex feudal obligations that nobody in the imperial administration understood or particularly wanted to learn about. Why this moment was different from all the previous challenges the Mongols had faced was that military solutions weren't applicable to administrative problems. You couldn't solve tax collection disputes by shooting arrows at them. You couldn't maintain irrigation systems through superior cavalry tactics. You couldn't resolve legal conflicts between different ethnic groups by demonstrating your ability to ride 3 horses simultaneously while firing a composite bow. The very skills that had made the Mongols unstoppable conquerors were largely irrelevant to the task of actually running an empire. Key factors that led to this transformation included the simple mathematical reality that the Mongol Empire had grown beyond the point where personal relationships and tribal customs could provide adequate governance. When your empire stretches from Korea to Hungary, you can't manage it through the traditional nomadic approach of gathering all the important people around a campfire and discussing things until everyone agrees. The logistics alone would require more horses than existed in Mongolia, and the travel time would mean that by the time you arrived at distant territories to resolve problems, those problems would have evolved into completely different crises. The turning point was also driven by economic necessity. Conquest was expensive, and maintaining the military forces required for continued expansion required steady income from conquered territories. But extracting that income efficiently required administrative systems that could manage complex economic relationships without destroying the productive capacity of conquered populations. The Mongols discovered that you couldn't fund continued military campaigns by simply looting everything valuable and moving on. At some point, you had to create sustainable economic systems that could generate wealth over time. The moment became a crisis when various Mongol leaders realized that their traditional approach to problem solving, gathering a large army and attacking whatever was causing trouble, was not only ineffective for administrative challenges, but was actually counterproductive. Using military force to resolve tax disputes, trade disagreements, or jurisdictional conflicts tended to reduce the economic productivity that military campaigns depended on, creating a downward spiral that threatened the entire imperial system. How this transformation unfolded reads like a medieval management consulting project implemented by people who had never heard of management consulting and would probably have shot anyone who suggested they needed it. The process was messy, contradictory, and involved more trial and error than anyone involved was comfortable admitting. But it ultimately produced innovations in imperial governance that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern administrative state-style. Resistance to change came from multiple directions and for entirely reasonable reasons. Traditional Mongol warriors were understandably concerned that adopting sedentary administrative practices would somehow contaminate their military culture and reduce their effectiveness as conquerors. They'd spent generations perfecting a lifestyle that produced the world's most successful military force, and proposals to modify that lifestyle in fundamental ways seemed like dangerous experiments with proven success. Chinese administrators, who had been incorporated into the Mongol system, were equally skeptical of changes that might undermine their expertise and reduce their influence. They'd survived the conquest by demonstrating their value as administrators, and reforms that emphasize Mongol approaches to governance threatened to make their knowledge less valuable. Persian and Central Asian bureaucrats had similar concerns about their positions in an evolving imperial hierarchy. Champions of change included pragmatic leaders who recognized that administrative reform was necessary for imperial survival, regardless of its impact on traditional culture. Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan's successor, became the primary advocate for systematic administrative development, partly because he understood that continued military success depended on efficient resource extraction from conquered territories. Yale, Chukai, and other foreign administrators who had proven their value to the imperial system became crucial allies in the reform process, not because they wanted to impose their cultural values on the Mongols, but because they understood that effective administration required combining the best elements of different governmental traditions rather than simply adopting one system. Wholesale-specific steps in the transformation process involved creating hybrid institutions that preserved Mongol military traditions while incorporating administrative innovations from conquered civilizations. The Mongols established parallel governmental structures that allowed traditional tribal leadership to coexist with bureaucratic administration, creating redundancy that provided flexibility while maintaining stability. Stages of development included initial experiments with tax farming systems borrowed from Chinese and Persian traditions, followed by the establishment of standardized legal codes that could be applied across different ethnic and religious communities, and eventually the creation of imperial administrative academies that trained Mongol nobles in the skills required for governing diverse populations. Obstacles encountered during this process were both practical and cultural. Practical problems included the challenge of creating communication systems that could coordinate administrative decisions across vast distances, developing record-keeping systems that could track complex economic relationships, and training sufficient numbers of administrators to staff governmental positions throughout the empire. Cultural obstacles were equally significant and more difficult to resolve. Many Mongol leaders were concerned that adopting sedentary administrative practices would somehow reduce their military effectiveness or compromise their cultural identity. These concerns weren't entirely irrational. History provided numerous examples of nomadic peoples who had lost their military advantages after adopting settled lifestyles. Breakthrough moments in the transformation process often involved demonstrating that administrative efficiency could enhance rather than compromise military effectiveness. When improved tax collection systems provided funding for larger and better equipped armies, when standardized legal procedures reduced internal conflicts that distracted from external campaigns, and when efficient logistics allowed military forces to operate at greater distances for longer periods. The practical benefits of administrative reform became obvious even to traditional skeptics. The role of individuals versus larger forces in driving this transformation reveals the complex interaction between personal leadership and historical necessity. Individual leaders like Genghis Khan and Yelu Chukai were crucial in championing specific reforms and overcoming resistance to change. But the broader transformation was driven by systemic pressures that would have required some form of administrative development regardless of which individuals were involved. The process also involved continuous adaptation and refinement rather than implementation of a predetermined plan. Each administrative innovation created new challenges that required further innovations, producing an evolutionary process where successful adaptations were retained and expanded, while unsuccessful experiments were abandoned or modified. This trial-and-error approach was consistent with traditional Mongol pragmatism but applied to problems that were fundamentally different from traditional military challenges. The new imperial system that emerged from this transformation process was unlike anything that had existed before in medieval politics. Rather than simply being a larger version of traditional nomadic confederation or a Mongol adaptation of existing imperial models, it was a hybrid system that combined elements from multiple governmental traditions while maintaining the flexibility and adaptability that had made Mongol military organization so successful. How things were different in the reformed empire was immediately apparent to anyone who compared pre-transformation and post-transformation Mongol administration. Where previous governance had been largely personal and informal, the new system included written legal codes, standardized administrative procedures, and institutional continuity that could survive changes in leadership. Where previous resource extraction had been largely through plunder and tribute, the new system included sophisticated tax collection, trade regulation, and economic development policies. Who won and who lost in this transformation reveals the complex effects of administrative reform on different groups within the empire. Traditional Mongol military elites generally maintained their political influence while gaining access to greater wealth through more efficient resource extraction. Foreign administrators who had proven their value during the transition period often found their position secure and their expertise more valued than before. Chinese, Persian, and other conquered populations experienced mixed results that depended largely on their specific circumstances and their ability to adapt to the new system. Those who could demonstrate useful skills or who lived in economically valuable territories often found their situations improved under standardized imperial administration. Those who lived in strategically unimportant areas or who lacked valuable skills sometimes found themselves worse off than they had been under previous local rulers. New rules and norms that governed the reformed empire reflected the hybrid nature of the administrative system. Legal procedures borrowed elements from Chinese, Persian, and Islamic legal traditions while maintaining Mongol preferences for practical solutions over theoretical consistency. Tax policies adapted proven techniques from different administrative traditions while preserving Mongol emphasis on efficiency and merit-based advancement. Economic regulations established standardized weights, measures, and currency systems that facilitated trade across the empire while allowing local variations that accommodated different commercial traditions. Military organization maintained traditional Mongol emphasis on mobility and flexibility while incorporating siege techniques. Logistic systems and strategic planning methods borrowed from conquered civilizations. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically shows the selective nature of Mongol adaptation. Core military practices, including cavalry tactics, archery techniques, and small unit coordination, remained largely unchanged because they continued to provide military advantages. Traditional Mongol values, including meritocracy, pragmatism, and tolerance for cultural diversity, were actually strengthened by administrative reforms that provided systematic ways to identify and reward talent regardless of ethnic background. What changed dramatically included the scale and complexity of governmental operations, the degree of institutional continuity and predictability, and the integration of diverse populations into unified administrative systems. The empire developed from a military confederation held together by personal relationships into a governmental system that could function effectively across multiple generations and vast distances. The new reality also included unprecedented levels of cultural exchange and technological transfer, as the administrative system created mechanisms for sharing innovations across different regions of the empire. Ideas, techniques, and artistic traditions that had previously been confined to specific geographic areas could now spread throughout the imperial system, creating a level of cross-cultural fertilization that had never been achieved before in Human history. Was this transformation from conquest-oriented nomadic confederation to sophisticated imperial administration a positive development that created stability and prosperity, or a negative change that corrupted traditional Mongol culture and ultimately weakened the empire? The answer depends largely on your perspective and your criteria for evaluation, but the evidence suggests that the transformation was both necessary for imperial survival and successful in achieving its primary objectives. Different perspectives on the reform process reflect different priorities and values. Traditional Mongol warriors, who valued military culture and nomadic independence, generally viewed administrative reforms with suspicion, seeing them as potentially corrupting influences that might reduce Mongol military effectiveness. Chinese and Persian administrators, who had experience with bureaucratic governance, generally viewed the reforms as long overdue improvements that brought the empire closer to civilized standards of government. Modern historians tend to evaluate the transformation based on its effectiveness in creating stable, prosperous, and culturally diverse imperial systems. From this perspective, the Mongol administrative reforms were remarkably successful in creating governmental institutions that could manage unprecedented diversity and scale while maintaining essential military capabilities. Short-term versus long-term effects reveal different aspects of the transformation's impact. In the short term, administrative reforms clearly improved the empire's ability to extract resources from conquered territories, maintain military forces, and coordinate complex operations across vast distances. These improvements contributed to continued military success and territorial expansion during the reigns of Jedi and his successors. Long-term effects were more mixed, partly because the success of administrative reforms created new challenges that subsequent generations of Mongol leaders were less equipped to handle. As the empire became more bureaucratic and settled, it gradually lost some of the adaptability and military innovation that had made the original conquests possible. Unintended consequences of the administrative transformation included the gradual cultural assimilation of Mongol elites into the civilizations they had conquered, which ultimately reduced their distinctiveness and their commitment to traditional nomadic values. The very success of the hybrid governmental system made it easier for Mongol leaders to adopt local customs and perspectives, which enhanced their effectiveness as regional rulers but reduced their identification with pan-imperial Mongol identity. Modern judgment versus contemporary views shows that most contemporary observers, whether Mongol or foreign, generally approved of the administrative reforms because they produced immediate improvements in governmental effectiveness and economic prosperity. Modern historians recognize both the achievements and the limitations of the transformation, appreciating its innovations while understanding its role in the empire's eventual fragmentation. In the years and decades that followed the Great Administrative Transformation, the Mongol Empire evolved in ways that would have made its founders simultaneously proud and horrified. The sophisticated governmental system that had emerged from the awkward transition between conquest and administration continued developing into something that was arguably more impressive than the original military achievements, but also increasingly unrecognizable as the creation of nomadic warriors who had started their careers living in felt tents and eating fermented maize milk. How things developed after the initial reforms resembled the political equivalent of watching your scrappy garage band evolve into a multinational corporation, technically more successful, but somehow less authentic in the process. The empire that had once moved across continents with the fluid mobility of a cavalry charge was becoming an institutional behemoth that required armies of administrators, complex bureaucratic procedures, and permanent infrastructure that was increasingly difficult to distinguish from the settled civilizations the Mongols had originally conquered. New challenges emerged that were completely different from the problems that had driven the original transformation. Instead of figuring out how to govern conquered territories while maintaining military effectiveness, later Mongol leaders had to solve problems, like managing succession disputes between relatives who controlled territories larger than most European kingdoms, coordinating economic policies across regions with completely different climates and resources, and maintaining cultural unity among populations who had never seen Mongolia and increasingly had no particular reason to care about traditional steppe customs. Evolution of the situation included the gradual development of regional specialization within the imperial system, as different parts of the empire adapted to local conditions in ways that made administrative sense but complicated central coordination. The Mongol administration in China evolved differently from Mongol governance in Persia, which developed along different lines from Mongol rule in Russia, creating a federal system that was more flexible than centralized autocracy, but also more prone to fragmentation and internal conflicts. Second-generation effects of the administrative transformation included the emergence of a new class of Mongol administrators who were more skilled at bureaucratic management than traditional military leadership. These administrators were often more effective at governing their territories than their warrior predecessors, but they were also less committed to maintaining the military culture and nomadic traditions that had originally made Mongol conquest possible. The most significant long-term development was the gradual cultural assimilation of Mongol elites into the civilizations they governed. This wasn't necessarily a conscious choice or a sign of weakness. It was often the most practical approach to effective governance. Mongol rulers in China found that adopting Chinese administrative traditions and cultural practices made them more effective at managing Chinese populations. Similarly, Mongol leaders in Persia discovered that incorporating Islamic governmental traditions enhanced their legitimacy and administrative efficiency. But this practical adaptation created an unintended consequence that would ultimately threaten imperial unity. As Mongol leaders became more effective regional rulers, they became less distinctively Mongol and less committed to maintain connections with other parts of the empire. The very success of local adaptation gradually undermined the cultural foundations that had held the empire together during its period of rapid expansion. The evolution of the Mongol Empire during this later period was shaped significantly by new important figures and institutions that were quite different from the original generation of steppe warriors and tribal leaders. These new players represented the maturation of the imperial system and its adaptation to the complexities of governing diverse, settled populations across vast distances. Genghis Khan, who became Great Khan in 1251, represented a new type of Mongol leader who combined traditional steppe military culture with sophisticated understanding of imperial administration. Unlike his predecessors, who had learned governance through trial and error during the conquest period, Genghis had grown up in an environment where administrative complexity was normal and expected. His approach to imperial management resembled modern corporate leadership more than traditional tribal chieftainship. He conducted systematic reviews of governmental efficiency, implemented standardized reporting procedures, and established performance metrics for regional administrators. His role in imperial development involved institutionalizing many of the informal practices that had evolved during the earlier transformation period, where previous leaders had improvised solutions to administrative challenges. Genghis created systematic approaches that could be replicated across different regions and could survive changes in leadership. This institutionalization was crucial for imperial stability, but it also marked a decisive shift away from the personal, relationship-based governance that had characterized earlier Mongol leadership. How Genghis differed from earlier players was most evident in his approach to military campaigns, which became increasingly professional and less personal than the heroic adventures of previous generations. Rather than leading cavalry charges personally or making tactical decisions based on immediate battlefield conditions, Mongol coordinated military operations through complex logistic systems and strategic planning that emphasized efficiency over individual heroics. Kublai Khan, who eventually became Emperor of China, represented an even more dramatic evolution in Mongol leadership. His contributions to the imperial system included the complete integration of Chinese governmental traditions with Mongol administrative practices, creating hybrid institutions that were more sophisticated than either culture had developed independently. But his approach also involved such thorough adoption of Chinese customs that many traditional Mongols questioned whether he was still authentically Mongol in any meaningful sense. The specific stories about these new elements reveal the tensions inherent in the empire's evolution. Kublai Khan's court in China operated according to Chinese ceremonial traditions, employed Chinese artistic and literary customs, and followed Chinese approaches to economic and social policy. This adaptation made him an extraordinarily effective ruler of China, but it also created cultural distance between his administration and the traditional Mongol heartland that complicated imperial unity and succession planning. New institutional developments during this period included the establishment of formal administrative academies that trained Mongol nobles in governmental skills, the creation of standardized legal codes that could be applied across different cultural regions, and the development of imperial communication systems that could coordinate policy decisions across unprecedented distances. These institutions represented genuine innovations in medieval governance, but they also reflected the empire's transformation from a nomadic military confederation into something that resembled modern bureaucratic states. The administrative academies, for example, produced Mongol leaders who were highly skilled at managing complex governmental operations, but often lacked the military experience and cultural grounding that had characterized previous generations. The emergence of these new players and institutions marked a fundamental shift in the nature of Mongol imperial leadership. Where original Mongol leaders had been warriors who learned administrative skills out of necessity, later leaders were increasingly administrators who maintained military traditions largely for ceremonial and legitimacy purposes. This evolution enhanced governmental effectiveness, but also created questions about cultural continuity and military readiness that would ultimately affect the empire's long-term stability. But some problems persisted throughout the empire's evolution, proving remarkably resistant to even the most sophisticated administrative reforms and political innovations. These continuing challenges revealed fundamental contradictions in the imperial system that couldn't be resolved through better management or more efficient bureaucracy, and would ultimately contribute to the empire's eventual fragmentation. Continuing challenges included the persistent tension between the nomadic military culture that had created the empire and the sedentary administrative requirements necessary for governing it effectively. This wasn't just a matter of lifestyle preferences or cultural nostalgia. It involved practical conflicts between the skills, values, and institutional arrangements that were optimal for conquest versus those that were necessary for stable governance. What didn't get resolved, despite decades of administrative innovation, was the fundamental problem of imperial succession. The Mongol Empire never developed a completely reliable method for transferring power from one generation to the next without creating opportunities for civil war, political fragmentation, or competitive struggles between different branches of the imperial family. Each succession crisis had the potential to tear the empire apart, and the administrative sophistication that made the empire more effective at governance also made succession disputes more complex and harder to resolve. New versions of old problems emerged as the empire evolved and expanded. The original challenge of maintaining military effectiveness while governing settled, populations was replaced by the challenge of maintaining imperial unity while allowing regional adaptation. The solution to the first problem, creating hybrid administrative systems, actually contributed to the second problem. By encouraging local specialization, that gradually reduced imperial cohesion. Cyclical patterns appeared in imperial politics as each generation of leaders had to balance competing demands for central coordination versus regional autonomy, military preparedness versus administrative efficiency, and cultural continuity versus practical adaptation. These cycles weren't random fluctuations. They reflected fundamental tensions in the imperial system that couldn't be permanently resolved, but had to be continuously managed through political skill and institutional flexibility. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clear when you understand that they involved conflicts between equally valid but incompatible objectives. The empire needed to maintain military effectiveness to defend against external threats and to preserve the cultural identity that legitimized Mongol rule. But it also needed to adapt to local conditions and adopt effective governmental practices to maintain internal stability and economic prosperity. These competing requirements couldn't be satisfied simultaneously through any single policy approach. Military effectiveness required maintaining nomadic traditions and warrior culture, while governmental efficiency required adopting sedentary administrative practices and local customs. Cultural continuity required preserving Mongol identity and steppe traditions, while practical governance required integration with conquered civilizations and their institutional arrangements. The most persistent issue was the gradual erosion of cultural unity as different parts of the empire adapted to local conditions in ways that enhanced regional effectiveness but reduced imperial cohesion. Mongol administrators in China became increasingly Chinese in their approaches to governance, while Mongol leaders in Persia adopted Islamic traditions, and Mongol rulers in Russia developed relationships with Orthodox Christianity and Slavic customs. Each of these adaptations made practical sense from a regional governance perspective, but their cumulative effect was to reduce the shared cultural foundation that had originally held the empire together. The empire became a collection of regional kingdoms that happened to be ruled by people who claimed Mongol heritage, rather than a unified political system based on shared Mongol identity and traditions. This cultural fragmentation was reinforced by practical considerations, including the distances involved in imperial communication, the complexity of coordinating policies across diverse regions, and the time and expense required for maintaining political relationships between distant parts of the empire. As regional administrators became more effective at local governance, they became less dependent on central coordination and less committed to maintaining imperial unity at the expense of regional interests. Compared to earlier periods of Mongol history, other empires of the medieval period, and modern attempts at managing large-scale political organizations, the later developments in the Mongol Empire reveal both the achievements and the limitations of their approach to imperial governance. Analysis of the later Mongol Empire compared to the conquest period shows that the administrative sophistication they developed was genuinely impressive and represented innovations that were centuries ahead of their time. The governmental systems they created were more efficient, more inclusive, and more adaptable than anything achieved by contemporary European kingdoms or Chinese dynasties. But this administrative success came at the cost of military effectiveness and cultural unity that had originally made the empire possible. What was unique about the Mongol approach to these challenges was their willingness to experiment with hybrid solutions that combined elements from multiple governmental traditions, rather than simply imposing a single system on all conquered territories. This flexibility allowed them to govern diverse populations more effectively than most empires, but it also made the empire more vulnerable to fragmentation as regional adaptations gradually reduced. Central coordination. What was universal about their experience was that all large-scale political organizations face similar tensions between central coordination and regional adaptation, between maintaining founding principles and adapting to changing circumstances, and between preserving cultural identity and achieving practical effectiveness. The specific solutions that the Mongols developed were unique, but the problems they were trying to solve are recognizable in the political challenges faced by other empires and modern states. Lessons that could be learned from the Mongol experience include the importance of institutional flexibility in managing diverse populations, the value of merit-based advancement in maintaining governmental effectiveness, and the challenges involved in maintaining cultural unity across vast distances and diverse populations. But the lessons also include warnings about the long-term costs of cultural adaptation and the difficulties involved in maintaining military effectiveness while developing administrative sophistication, patterns that repeated elsewhere in medieval political development include the tendency for nomadic empires to gradually adopt the governmental practices of settled civilizations, the challenges faced by all large empires in maintaining unity across diverse populations, and the recurring conflicts between military and administrative priorities in imperial governance. What modern states can learn from the Mongol experience is that political innovation often requires combining elements from different traditions, rather than simply adopting established models. That effective governance of diverse populations requires tolerance for local variation within unified systems, and that maintaining organizational effectiveness over time requires continuous adaptation to changing circumstances while preserving core institutional capabilities. The comparative analysis also reveals that the Mongol Empire's eventual fragmentation wasn't necessarily a sign of failure. It may have been an inevitable result of successfully adapting to the challenges of governing territories that were too large and diverse to be managed as a single political unit. The empire's legacy may be less in its territorial extent than in the governmental innovations it developed and the cultural exchanges it facilitated. By the late 13th century, signs pointed to a fundamental transformation in the nature of the Mongol Empire that would have been unthinkable to the original steppe warriors who had conquered half the known world through superior horsemanship and an unhealthy obsession with archery accuracy. The warning signs weren't dramatic military defeats or spectacular political collapses. They were subtle shifts in priorities, cultural practices, and institutional arrangements that collectively indicated the empire was evolving into something completely different from what its founders had created. Warning signs that astute observers could have recognized included the increasing tendency for Mongol leaders to spend more time in permanent capitals than in mobile military camps, the growing importance of administrative skills relative to military prowess in determining political advancement, and the gradual adoption of local customs and religious practices that were more appropriate for governing settled populations than for maintaining nomadic warrior culture. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the complex nature of imperial transformation. Sophisticated administrators like those in Kublai Khan's Chinese court could clearly observe that their governmental systems were becoming more efficient, more stable, and more capable of managing complex economic and social relationships. From their perspective, these changes represented positive evolution that enhanced the empire's long-term viability and effectiveness. What these same leaders often missed was that their administrative success was gradually undermining the cultural foundations and military capabilities that had originally made Mongol conquest possible. The empire was becoming better at governance, but less distinctively Mongol, more administratively sophisticated, but less militarily innovative, more regionally adapted, but imperially imperially unified. Resistance to inevitable change came from traditionalist factions within the Mongol elite who recognized that cultural assimilation and administrative sophistication were threatening essential aspects of Mongol identity. These traditionalists weren't simply nostalgic conservatives. They understood that the military effectiveness that had created the empire depended on maintaining cultural practices and institutional arrangements that were incompatible with the requirements of efficient imperial administration. But their resistance was largely ineffective because the changes they opposed weren't the result of conscious political decisions that could be reversed through better leadership or different policies. The transformation was driven by practical necessities that couldn't be ignored without accepting administrative chaos and economic decline. Regional Mongol leaders who tried to govern Chinese populations according to traditional steppe customs discovered that such approaches were not only ineffective, but actively counterproductive. The inevitability of change became apparent when attempts to maintain traditional practices consistently produced worse outcomes than adaptation to local conditions. Mongol administrators who insisted on traditional nomadic legal procedures found themselves unable to resolve commercial disputes in settled agricultural communities. Military leaders who maintained traditional steppe tactical approaches found themselves increasingly outmatched by enemies who had adapted to Mongol innovations and developed effective countermeasures. The most telling sign of impending transformation was the emergence of generational differences within Mongol leadership. Older leaders who had personal experience with traditional nomadic life maintained emotional attachments to steppe customs and warrior culture, while younger leaders who had grown up in imperial administrative environments often found traditional practices irrelevant to the challenges they faced in governing diverse, sedentary populations. These generational differences weren't just matters of personal preference or cultural nostalgia. They reflected fundamentally different understandings of what it meant to be Mongol and what kinds of skills and institutions were necessary for maintaining political power and cultural identity in the changed circumstances that imperial success had created. How the unified Mongol Empire ended wasn't through a single dramatic collapse or decisive military defeat, but through a gradual process of fragmentation that was so subtle and incremental that many contemporaries didn't recognize it was happening until the process was irreversible. The empire didn't die. It evolved into multiple successor states that maintained Mongol political traditions while adapting to regional conditions in ways that made imperial reunification increasingly unlikely. Specific events that marked the empire's transformation included the formal division of imperial territories among different branches of the Mongol royal family, the establishment of separate administrative systems for different regions, and the gradual reduction of meaningful coordination between distant parts of the empire. But these events were symptoms of deeper changes rather than causes of imperial fragmentation. Final major players in the empire's transformation included leaders like Kublai Khan, who completed the conquest of China while simultaneously establishing governmental systems that were fundamentally Chinese rather than Mongol in their approach to administration, law, and cultural policy. Kublai's success as Emperor of China was remarkable by any standard, but it also represented the logical endpoint of the cultural assimilation process that had been gradually transforming Mongol leadership throughout the empire. In Central Asia and Persia, similar processes produced Mongol leaders who were increasingly indistinguishable from traditional Islamic rulers in their governmental practices, religious affiliations, and cultural identities. The Ilkhanate in Persia became an Islamic state that happened to be ruled by people of Mongol ancestry, rather than a Mongol state that happened to govern Persian populations. Last attempts to preserve imperial unity involved efforts to maintain ceremonial recognition of the Great Khan's authority while allowing practical autonomy for regional rulers. These attempts were political fictions that satisfied nobody. They didn't provide the regional autonomy that local leaders needed for effective governance. And they didn't maintain the imperial coordination that traditional Mongols expected. From unified leadership to dramatic final moments in the empire's traditional form included succession disputes that could no longer be resolved through the traditional Kurultai system because the distances involved made gathering representatives from throughout the empire practically impossible. When regional Mongol leaders could no longer participate meaningfully in imperial decision-making, the political institutions that had held the empire together became irrelevant to their practical governance needs. The gradual decline process was more significant than any single dramatic event because it reflected the empire's fundamental success rather than its failure. The Mongol Empire had become so successful at adapting to local conditions and governing diverse populations that its regional components no longer needed central coordination to function effectively. Imperial unity had become a luxury rather than necessity. Symbolic endpoints included moments when regional Mongol rulers stopped seeking confirmation of their authority from the Great Khan, when they began conducting independent diplomatic relations with neighboring states, and when they established succession practices that ignored imperial preferences in favor of local political considerations. But the most significant symbolic transformation was cultural rather than political. The end of the unified empire was marked not by military defeats or political declarations, but by the point at which Mongol leaders in different regions had become so thoroughly assimilated into local cultures that they shared little more than common ancestry and historical memory. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Ashokatai Khanate in Central Asia continued to exist as political entities for centuries after the unified empire had effectively ceased to function. But these successor states were Mongol in name and historical origin, rather than in cultural practice or institutional arrangement. The transformation was completed when these successor states began fighting each other using the same tactics, administrative systems, and political principles as their non-Mongol neighbors. When former components of the Mongol Empire became indistinguishable from other regional powers in their military organization, governmental practices, and cultural identities, the imperial experiment had effectively ended, even though some of its institutional remnants continued to exist. The irony of the empire's end was that it was caused by success rather than failure. The Mongol Empire had been so effective at creating governmental systems that could adapt to local conditions and manage diverse populations that its regional components became capable of independent existence. The very achievements that had made the empire great ultimately made imperial unity unnecessary and therefore unsustainable. Analysis of the causes behind the empire's fragmentation reveals a complex interaction between structural contradictions, practical challenges, and cultural evolution that made the empire's transformation inevitable rather than accidental. The end of unified Mongol rule wasn't the result of poor leadership, external military pressure, or administrative incompetence. It was the logical consequence of successfully solving the problems that had originally motivated imperial expansion. Internal problems that contributed to fragmentation included the fundamental incompatibility between nomadic military culture and sedentary administrative requirements. The empire had been created by people whose entire lifestyle was optimized for mobility, conquest, and adaptation to changing circumstances. But governing settled populations required institutional stability, cultural continuity, and administrative predictability that were difficult to maintain while preserving the flexibility and adaptability that had made Mongol conquest possible. External pressures that accelerated the fragmentation process included the military adaptation of neighboring peoples who had learned to counter traditional Mongol tactical advantages. As European, Chinese, and Islamic military organizations developed effective responses to Mongol innovations. Continued expansion became more difficult and expensive, reducing the economic incentives that had originally motivated imperial unity. The role of individuals versus historical forces in the empire's transformation shows that while specific leaders made decisions that accelerated or delayed fragmentation, the underlying causes were systemic rather than personal. Even exceptionally capable leaders like Kublai Khan could only manage the tensions between imperial unity and regional adaptation. They couldn't resolve the fundamental contradictions that made these tensions inevitable. What could have been done differently is a question that reveals the limited options available to Mongol leaders once the empire had reached a certain size and complexity. Maintaining traditional nomadic practices would have made effective governance impossible, while adapting to local conditions inevitably reduced imperial unity. Alternative approaches might have delayed fragmentation, but probably couldn't have prevented it given the scale and diversity of the territories involved. Inevitability versus contingency in the empire's transformation reflects the broader question of whether large-scale political organizations can maintain unity indefinitely while adapting to changing circumstances. The Mongol experience suggests that successful adaptation to local conditions creates centrifugal forces that eventually overcome the benefits of central coordination, making fragmentation a natural outcome of imperial success rather than imperial failure. The structural factors that made fragmentation inevitable included the distances involved in imperial communication, the time and expense required for coordinating policies across diverse regions, and the practical advantages of regional specialization over imperial standardization. As the empire became more administratively sophisticated, these practical considerations increasingly outweighed the political and military benefits of maintaining unified command. Cultural evolution also played a crucial role in making fragmentation inevitable. As Mongol leaders adapted to local conditions and adopted local customs, they gradually lost the shared cultural foundation that had originally provided the basis for imperial unity. Regional Mongol rulers eventually had more in common with their local subjects than with Mongol leaders in distant territories. Economic factors reinforced the fragmentation process as regional specialization made different parts of the empire increasingly dependent on local rather than imperial economic relationships. Trade networks, tax systems, and resource allocation patterns gradually realigned along regional rather than imperial lines, reducing the economic incentives for maintaining political unity. The most significant factor in making fragmentation inevitable was generational change within Mongol leadership. Leaders who had personal experience with traditional nomadic life maintained emotional and cultural connections to imperial unity, while subsequent generations who had grown up in settled administrative environments often found imperial coordination irrelevant to their practical governance challenges. As older generations died, the personal relationships and cultural commitments that had maintained imperial unity were not automatically transferred to their successors. The immediate aftermath of the Mongol Empire's fragmentation was remarkably peaceful considering the potential for chaos that such a massive political transformation might have created. Rather than collapsing into anarchy or civil war, the empire evolved into a collection of successor states that maintained many Mongol governmental innovations, while adapting to regional political realities in ways that actually enhanced rather than reduced their effectiveness as regional powers. The description of what immediately followed the end of unified imperial rule resembles a successful corporate spin-off rather than a business failure. Each successor state inherited valuable institutional assets, maintained beneficial relationships with former imperial partners, and continued operating according to proven management principles while adapting to more focused market conditions. Who stepped into the vacuum left by imperial fragmentation were the regional Mongol dynasties that had already been functioning as semi-autonomous governmental systems. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Sughatai Khanate in Central Asia simply formalized their independence while maintaining many of the administrative innovations and cultural practices they had developed as components of the unified empire. Short-term consequences of the transition included increased regional specialization, as each successor state could focus on governing populations with more similar cultural backgrounds and economic systems. This specialization often improved governmental effectiveness because regional rulers could adopt policies that were optimized for local conditions without having to consider their impact on distant territories with different needs and circumstances. Contemporary reactions to the empire's transformation varied significantly depending on perspective and location. Chinese populations generally experienced the transition as an improvement because the Yuan dynasty could focus exclusively on Chinese governmental traditions and economic systems, without having to accommodate the needs of Central Asian nomads or Persian administrators. Persian and Central Asian populations had similar experiences as their regional. Mongol rulers adopted Islamic governmental practices and cultural traditions that were more familiar and acceptable than the hybrid systems that had characterized the unified empire. European populations in areas controlled by the Golden Horde found that regional autonomy allowed for more flexible relationships with local nobility and religious institutions. Attempts at revival or continuation of unified imperial authority were largely unsuccessful because they conflicted with the practical advantages of regional specialization. Occasional efforts to restore imperial coordination generally failed because they required sacrificing the governmental effectiveness that regional adaptation had made possible. The immediate legacy of imperial fragmentation also included the preservation and continued development of Mongol innovations in military organization, administrative efficiency, and cultural tolerance. Rather than disappearing with the unified empire, these innovations continued to influence governmental development in the successor states and were often transmitted to neighboring political systems through diplomatic contact and cultural exchange. Perhaps most significantly, the immediate aftermath demonstrated that the Mongol Empire's most important achievements weren't territorial extent or military conquest, but the institutional innovations and cultural syntheses that had enabled unprecedented levels of political coordination and cultural exchange across diverse populations. These achievements survived imperial fragmentation and continued to influence political development long after the unified empire had ceased to exist. The legacy of the Mongol Empire shaped the development of global civilization in ways that are so fundamental to how the modern world operates that we often forget they had to be invented by someone. The Mongols didn't just conquer territories and then disappear into historical footnotes. They created institutional innovations, cultural exchanges, and political precedents that influenced the development of governmental systems, military organization, and international relations for centuries after their unified empire had fragmented into regional successor states. Specific influences of Mongol governance can be traced through the administrative systems of successor empires that adopted and adapted Mongol innovations in bureaucratic organization, legal procedures, and military command structures. The Ottoman Empire, which dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, borrowed heavily from Mongol approaches to managing diverse populations, integrating foreign expertise, and maintaining military effectiveness while governing settled territories. Russian political development was similarly shaped by centuries of Mongol rule that introduced administrative practices, legal concepts, and governmental institutions that became fundamental features of Russian imperial systems. The centralized autocracy that characterized Russian government through the Tsarist and Soviet Periods reflected organizational principles that were originally developed by Mongol administrators who needed to coordinate policies across vast distances and diverse populations. How later generations viewed the Mongol Empire reveals the complex relationship between historical memory and political legitimacy. Successor states that had emerged from Mongol rule often maintained ambivalent attitudes toward their imperial heritage, acknowledging the administrative innovations and cultural achievements they had inherited while distancing themselves from the military conquest and nomadic traditions that had created those achievements. Chinese dynasties that followed the Yuan period generally portrayed Mongol rule as a foreign occupation that had temporarily interrupted the natural development of Chinese civilization. But they quietly maintained many of the administrative innovations, legal procedures, and governmental institutions that Mongol rulers had developed, suggesting that their public criticism of Mongol methods was more about political legitimacy than practical assessment of governmental effectiveness. Myths versus realities that developed around Mongol history reflect the tendency for later generations to either demonize or romanticize historical periods that don't fit conventional categories of political development. European historical traditions often portrayed the Mongols as destructive barbarians who had threatened Christian civilization, while overlooking the administrative sophistication and cultural tolerance that had characterized Mongol governance of European territories. Persian and Central Asian traditions developed more nuanced perspectives that acknowledged both the military destruction and the cultural achievements of Mongol rule. These traditions recognized that Mongol conquest had been traumatic for existing populations, while also appreciating that Mongol governance had created opportunities for cultural exchange and economic development that wouldn't have been possible under previous political systems. Why the Mongol Empire remained important to later historical development, even when its direct political influence had ended, was its demonstration that large-scale political organizations could successfully integrate diverse populations through institutional flexibility rather than cultural uniformity. This precedent influenced the development of later empires that faced similar challenges in governing multicultural territories. The empire also established practical precedents for international diplomacy, trade regulation, and military cooperation that became standard features of interstate relations. Mongol approaches to managing diplomatic immunity, commercial law, and military alliances were adopted by successor states and transmitted to neighboring political systems, creating a foundation for international relations that persisted long after the empire itself had disappeared. Perhaps most significantly, the Mongol Empire demonstrated that political innovation could emerge from unexpected sources and that effective governance required adapting to local conditions rather than imposing uniform systems. These lessons influenced political thinking throughout Eurasia and contributed to the development of more flexible and adaptive approaches to imperial administration that characterized later periods of political development. Why people forgot or minimized Mongol achievements often reflected the political needs of successor states that wanted to emphasize their independence from foreign rule, while quietly maintaining the institutional innovations that had made effective governance possible. Today, we can see echoes of Mongol organizational principles and institutional innovations in modern examples that range from multinational corporations to international organizations, though few people recognize the historical connections between contemporary management practices and medieval nomadic governance systems. The similarities aren't coincidental. They reflect common solutions to universal problems of coordinating complex organizations across diverse populations and vast distances. Specific parallels between Mongol administrative innovations and modern organizational systems include approaches to merit-based advancement that prioritize demonstrated competence over inherited status or cultural background. Modern multinational corporations that promote employees based on performance, rather than nationality or family connections, are implementing principles that the Mongols pioneered in their approach to imperial administration. The Mongol emphasis on cultural tolerance and institutional flexibility finds modern expression in contemporary approaches to managing diverse workforces and international operations. Companies that adapt their management practices to local conditions while maintaining unified corporate objectives are following strategies that would have been familiar to Mongol administrators who had to govern Chinese farmers, Persian merchants, and European craftsmen using appropriately different methods while maintaining imperial coordination. What hasn't changed about human nature, as demonstrated by both Mongol history and contemporary experience, is the tendency for people to resist changes that threaten their established positions while embracing innovations that enhance their opportunities. Mongol administrators face the same challenges that modern managers encounter when implementing organizational reforms: skepticism from traditionalists, competition between different departments or regions, and the difficulty of maintaining coordination while encouraging local initiative. Similar patterns in different contexts appear in modern international relations, where successful organizations must balance central coordination with regional autonomy, maintain cultural diversity, while preserving institutional unity, and adapt to local conditions while preserving core organizational principles. The European Union, for example, faces challenges that are recognizably similar to those that confronted Mongol imperial administrators: how to maintain political coordination across culturally diverse territories while allowing regional variation. In governmental practices, lessons for contemporary issues that emerge from studying Mongol administrative innovations include the importance of institutional flexibility in managing rapid growth, the value of incorporating expertise from diverse sources rather than relying exclusively on traditional approaches, and the recognition that successful organizations must continuously adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential capabilities. Modern military organizations have rediscovered many Mongol innovations in command structure, tactical flexibility, and operational coordination. Special forces operations that emphasize small unit autonomy, adaptive tactics, and mission-oriented leadership reflect principles that were fundamental to Mongol military organization. The contemporary emphasis on network-centric warfare and distributed command systems represents a return to organizational approaches that the Mongols had perfected centuries before the invention of modern communication technologies. Information technology companies that must coordinate global operations while adapting to local markets face challenges that are structurally similar to those that confronted Mongol administrators. The solutions that prove most effective combine centralized strategic planning with decentralized operational implementation, maintaining cultural sensitivity while preserving institutional identity, and encouraging innovation while maintaining coordination, are recognizably similar to approaches that the Mongols developed for managing their transcontinental empire. International humanitarian organizations and global nonprofits often discover that effective operations require combining universal principles with local adaptation in ways that parallel Mongol approaches to imperial governance. Organizations that succeed in diverse cultural environments typically develop institutional flexibility, cultural competence, and adaptive capacity that would have been familiar to Mongol administrators who had to provide effective governance across equally diverse populations. The most striking modern parallel involves the challenge of maintaining organizational effectiveness while scaling operations across vast distances and diverse populations. Whether the organization is a medieval empire, a modern corporation, or an international institution, success requires solving similar problems, coordinating complex operations across time zones and cultural boundaries, maintaining quality control while allowing local variation, and preserving institutional identity while adapting to regional conditions. Contemporary cybersecurity and information warfare also reflect patterns that would have been recognizable to Mongol military strategists. The emphasis on speed, adaptability, and psychological warfare in modern conflict mirrors tactical approaches that the Mongols pioneered in their military campaigns. The contemporary recognition that information dominance and technological superiority can compensate for numerical disadvantages echoes Mongol innovations in using superior intelligence and tactical flexibility to defeat larger enemy forces. Even now, the Mongol Empire influences modern areas of human activity in ways that are often invisible to casual observation, but fundamental to how contemporary institutions operate. The influence extends beyond obvious historical connections to include basic assumptions about how large-scale organizations should be structured, how diverse populations can be governed effectively, and how cultural differences can be managed. Within unified institutional frameworks, academic study of the Mongol Empire has experienced a renaissance in recent decades, as historians have recognized that traditional European-centered approaches to medieval history had systematically underestimated the sophistication and global significance of Mongol governmental innovations. Modern scholarship has revealed that many political and administrative practices that were previously attributed to European or Chinese innovation were actually developed or significantly advanced by Mongol administrators. Popular culture representations of the Mongol Empire have gradually evolved from stereotypical portrayals of destructive barbarians to more nuanced recognition of their administrative achievements and cultural contributions. While popular media still emphasizes the military aspects of Mongol history, there's growing appreciation for their innovations in governance, law, and international relations that influence political development throughout Eurasia. Political discourse in modern nations that were historically part of the Mongol Empire often reflects ambivalent attitudes toward this heritage. Countries like Russia, China, and Iran acknowledge the historical importance of Mongol rule while maintaining complex relationships with that legacy that reflect contemporary political needs and cultural sensitivities. Social movements that advocate for political decentralization, cultural autonomy, and institutional flexibility sometimes reference historical precedents that include Mongol approaches to governing diverse populations. While these movements rarely make explicit connections to medieval history, their emphasis on combining unity with diversity and their preference for adaptive institutions over rigid bureaucracies reflect principles that were fundamental to Mongol political organization. Why people still care about the Mongol Empire, despite the centuries that have passed since its political influence ended, reflects the continuing relevance of the questions it attempted to answer. How can large-scale political organizations maintain effectiveness while governing diverse populations? How can institutions adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential capabilities? How can cultural differences be managed within unified systems? These questions remain central to contemporary political challenges, and the Mongol experience continues to provide valuable insights into the possibilities and limitations of institutional innovation. The empire's legacy lies not in its territorial extent or military conquest, but in its demonstration that political creativity can emerge from unexpected sources and that effective governance requires continuous adaptation to changing circumstances while maintaining essential organizational capabilities. Looking back across the centuries of Mongol history and the vast territories that once comprised their empire, we've seen major themes that reveal as much about human nature and political possibility as they do about one specific civilization's remarkable achievements. The journey from Temüjin's desperate childhood on the steppes to the sophisticated administrative systems that govern territories from Korea to Hungary represents one of history's most dramatic Examples of institutional innovation and cultural adaptation. Key patterns that emerge throughout our exploration include the consistent Mongol ability to transform challenges into advantages through creative problem-solving and institutional flexibility. When traditional nomadic governance proved inadequate for ruling settled populations, they developed hybrid systems that combined the best elements of different governmental traditions. When military conquest created administrative burdens that threatened to overwhelm their organizational capacity, they created merit-based bureaucracies that could integrate talent from any cultural background. Most surprising discoveries in this historical journey include the recognition that the Mongol Empire's greatest achievements weren't military, but administrative, and that their most lasting contributions to human civilization weren't territorial conquests, but institutional innovations that influenced political development for centuries after their unified empire had ceased to exist. The stereotypical image of destructive barbarian hordes dissolves when confronted with evidence of sophisticated legal systems, efficient economic policies, and cultural tolerance that surpassed anything achieved by contemporary civilizations. Most important takeaways from the Mongol experience involve lessons about the relationship between cultural identity and institutional effectiveness, the possibilities and limitations of large-scale political organization, and the unexpected sources from which political innovation can emerge. The Mongols demonstrated that effective governance requires adapting to local conditions while maintaining essential organizational capabilities. That cultural diversity can strengthen rather than weaken political institutions, and that traditional assumptions about civilization and barbarism often obscure rather than illuminate historical reality. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reflects the broader transformation in historical scholarship that has recognized the global significance of non-European political traditions and the sophisticated achievements of nomadic civilizations. What initially appeared to be a story about military conquest revealed itself to be a complex narrative about institutional innovation, cultural exchange, and the challenges of managing diversity within unified political systems. The pattern recognition that emerges from studying Mongol history reveals recurring themes in human political organization, the tension between central coordination and local autonomy, the challenge of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances, and the difficulty of preserving founding principles while scaling institutions to meet growing responsibilities. Perhaps most significantly, the Mongol story illustrates that political creativity and institutional innovation can emerge from unexpected sources, and that effectiveness often matters more than tradition in determining which governmental approaches survive and spread. The empire's success resulted not from superior military technology or cultural sophistication, but from willingness to experiment with new approaches and abandon practices that didn't produce desired results. The breadth of Mongol influence across time and geography demonstrates that their historical significance extends far beyond their military achievements to include fundamental contributions to political science, administrative practice, and cultural exchange that continue to influence how we think about governance, organization, and international relations in the contemporary world. One final compelling anecdote that encapsulates the broader themes we've explored involves the last great Kurultai, the assembly of Mongol leaders that was held in 1260 to resolve the succession dispute between Kublai Khan and his brother, Arik Berksay. This gathering represents both the culmination of traditional Mongol political practices and the beginning of their transformation into something entirely different. The Kurultai was supposed to function according to ancient steppe traditions where tribal leaders would debate until consensus emerged about who was best qualified to lead the confederation. But by 1260, The tribal leaders included Chinese administrators who had never seen a traditional nomadic camp, Persian scholars who conducted their deliberations in Arabic, and European advisors who understood Latin better than Mongolian. The assembly that was meant to preserve traditional decision-making processes had become a multinational diplomatic conference. Background to this final story reveals the fundamental transformation that had occurred in Mongol political culture. The participants in the 1260 Kurultai weren't discussing whether to launch raids against neighboring tribes or where to find the best grazing for their horses. They were debating fiscal policy, administrative reform, and diplomatic relations. With settled governments that controlled populations numbering in the millions. What happened during the assembly illustrates the complexity that had evolved in Mongol political organization. Kublai Khan's supporters argued that effective governance required adapting to Chinese governmental traditions and administrative practices, while Arik Bey's faction maintained that such adaptation would destroy essential Mongol identity and military effectiveness. Both sides were correct, which made the dispute impossible to resolve through traditional consensus. Building. Key players in this final drama included advisors and administrators who embodied the cultural synthesis that had become characteristic of Mongol governance. Chinese ministers who had learned to think strategically about steppe warfare, Persian bureaucrats who understood both Islamic law and Mongol customs, and Mongol nobles who were equally comfortable in imperial palaces and military camps all participated in deliberations that would determine the future direction of Eurasian political development. What the story reveals about the broader themes of Mongol history is that their most significant achievement wasn't creating the world's largest empire, but demonstrating that political institutions could successfully integrate diverse cultural traditions while maintaining organizational effectiveness. The 1260 Kurultai failed to preserve traditional Mongol political unity, but it succeeded in creating a template for multicultural governance that influenced political development throughout Eurasia. How this story connects to everything we've discussed becomes clear when we recognize that the assembly's failure to maintain imperial unity was actually a success in demonstrating the viability of institutional adaptation. The Mongol Empire fragmented not because its political innovations had failed, but because they had succeeded so completely that regional adaptation made central coordination unnecessary. The memorable final image that emerges from this story is of political leaders from across the known world gathering in a traditional Mongol assembly to debate the future of global governance using governmental concepts and administrative techniques that none of their ancestors could have imagined. The Kurultai had evolved from a gathering of tribal chieftains discussing pastoral strategies into an international conference addressing questions about political organization that remain relevant to contemporary debates about governance, diversity, and institutional effectiveness. This transformation from traditional tribal assembly to a multicultural political conference encapsulates the entire Mongol historical experience. An unlikely group of people from an unlikely place solving unlikely problems through institutional creativity and cultural adaptation, leaving behind innovations that continue to influence how we think about politics, administration, and international relations centuries after their empire had evolved into something completely different from what its founders had originally envisioned. The general conclusion to our journey through Mongol history brings us back to those fundamental questions about human nature and political possibility that make historical study more than just an exercise in memorizing dates and names. The Mongol Empire emerged from the steppes not because its founders were inherently superior to other people, but because circumstances forced them to develop institutional solutions to problems that other civilizations hadn't yet encountered or hadn't been motivated to solve. Appreciation for this historical journey includes recognition that the past offers more than entertainment or cultural decoration. It provides insights into the range of human political creativity and the unexpected, sources from which innovation can emerge. The Mongol experience reminds us that effectiveness often matters more than tradition, that diversity can strengthen rather than weaken institutions, and that the future frequently belongs to those who are willing to experiment with new approaches rather than those who perfect old ones. The invitation to reflection that emerges from studying Mongol history involves considering what lessons their experience might offer for contemporary challenges in governance, organization, and cultural integration. Their story suggests that human political creativity is far more flexible and adaptive than we often assume, and that institutional innovation can emerge from the most unlikely sources when circumstances demand it. The peaceful closing thought that lingers from this exploration is that the Mongol Empire's most lasting contribution wasn't its territorial extent or military dominance, but its demonstration that people from vastly different backgrounds can work together effectively when institutions are designed to accommodate diversity rather than enforce uniformity. In a world that continues to struggle with questions about cultural difference, political cooperation, and institutional effectiveness, the Mongol legacy offers both inspiration and practical guidance for those willing to learn from history's most unlikely success story. As we reach the end of this narrative exploration, it's worth reflecting on how the Mongol story demonstrates both the possibilities and the challenges of translating complex historical realities into engaging storytelling that can reach contemporary audiences without sacrificing scholarly accuracy or analytical depth. The template structure we followed, moving from individual stories to institutional analysis, from dramatic events to long-term consequences, from specific examples to broader patterns, mirrors the way that historical understanding typically develops. We begin with compelling personalities and dramatic events that capture our attention, then gradually expand our perspective to encompass the larger forces and longer-term developments that give those individual stories their broader significance. Throughout this journey, we've seen how the Mongol experience challenges many common assumptions about medieval history, political development, and cultural interaction. Their story resists easy categorization because it involves nomadic peoples who created sophisticated administrative systems, military conquerors who became innovative administrators, and traditional cultures that successfully adapted to rapidly changing circumstances. The humor and contemporary analogies we've employed serve a serious analytical purpose beyond mere entertainment. When we compare Mongol administrative challenges to modern corporate management, or describe their governmental evolution in terms of contemporary organizational theory, we're highlighting genuine structural similarities that illuminate both historical and contemporary political processes. These comparisons work because the fundamental challenges of large-scale organization, coordinating diverse groups, managing complex operations across vast distances, balancing flexibility with consistency, maintaining effectiveness while adapting to changing circumstances, are universal human problems that appear in different forms across different historical periods. The conversational tone and modern references we've maintained help bridge the gap between medieval historical experiences and contemporary concerns, making it easier for modern audiences to understand why these historical developments remain relevant to current political challenges and organizational questions. But the most important aspect of this narrative approach is its recognition that history isn't just about what happened in the past. It's about understanding the range of human political possibility and the unexpected ways that people have solved complex problems throughout human experience. The Mongol Empire represents one particularly dramatic example of institutional innovation and cultural adaptation, but the broader lessons about flexibility, merit-based advancement, cultural tolerance, and adaptive governance apply to contemporary challenges in corporate management. international relations, and domestic political organization. The story we've told illustrates that effective historical narrative requires balancing multiple perspectives and avoiding the temptation to oversimplify complex developments for the sake of dramatic clarity. The Mongol experience was simultaneously brutal and sophisticated, destructive and creative, traditional and innovative, contradictions that reflect the complexity of human political experience rather than inconsistencies in historical evidence. As we conclude this exploration, the most lasting impression should be that history offers practical wisdom for contemporary challenges, that political innovation can emerge from unexpected sources, and that human institutional creativity is far more flexible and adaptive than conventional assumptions might suggest. The gentle fate of our narrative reflects the way that historical influences typically work, not through dramatic interventions or sudden transformations, but through gradual processes of institutional evolution and cultural adaptation that continue to shape human political experience long after the original innovators have disappeared from the historical stage. In the quiet aftermath of our journey through Mongol history, what remains is appreciation for human political creativity, recognition of the enduring relevance of historical experience, and perhaps a deeper understanding of both the possibilities and the challenges involved in creating institutions that can successfully serve diverse populations while maintaining effectiveness across time and changing circumstances.